Okay, hi everybody. My name is Lauren, and my topic was the 2001 anthrax attacks. So, just a quick agenda. We're going to go over the background. I want to give you a brief timeline of what exactly happened and how people are exposed. Then, we're going to talk about what went wrong and what we could be doing about it in the future, and then just a quick piece on policy. So the first piece is the background. So the first letters were sent out on September 18th of 2001. These were anonymous letters sent through the Postal Service to media outlets and congressional offices, specifically to individual people. There were a total of 5 deaths and 22 injuries. That number changes depending on which source you're looking at, but in class we used the number 22 cases, so that's what I went with. And then this entire event, both the attacks themselves and the investigation that went on afterward, has been dubbed Amerithrax. So going over a quick timeline, the first letters were mailed on September 18th of 2001. And the important thing to notice about this is that this is just after 9/11. I mean, it's just about a week. And so really take that in consideration when you're thinking about the status and the state of the country. These letters were mailed with anthrax spores and using the U.S. Postal Service, as I mentioned. On October 4th, so about 2 or 3 weeks later, we have the first hospitalization and the first death the next day. On October 9th, we have additional letters mailed out, and these actually use anthrax powder, which was frankly a better form of it if you were talking about trying to affect the most people. And this is when the FBI started getting involved. On October 16th, the son of a producer tests positive. And this is something that I just personally wanted to include because it's an innocent. It wasn't one of the people who the letters were mailed at. It wasn't a postal worker. It's just someone who happened to be there because of family. On November 21st, the fifth person dies. So this is officially the end of the attacks themselves. But from then up until February 19th of the next year, the entire investigation is going on. On February 19th, that investigation was closed, with the conclusion being that Dr. Bruce Ivins, who had previously worked for the US government, was being held responsible. He actually died via suicide during the investigation. But an important thing to understand and realize is that this result has actually been looked at by an outside source who found that while the science could support this, it doesn't necessarily prove it. So that's important to realize. When we're looking at exposure, there are 3 routes primarily and then a 4th that we'll kind of tack on. We have talked about these previously in class, so I'm not going to go too in depth on them. But cutaneous anthrax is the most mild form, and you tend to get it through an open wound. Gastrointestinal anthrax comes from eating raw or undercooked meat, and it's very rare. I don't think it's been found in the US. Inhalation anthrax, that's what we saw in these attacks. It is the most severe form. It has a 90% mortality rate if it's not treated, and that's primarily due to nonspecific symptoms, cough, chill, fever, things that could really be anything, and that your first thought is not anthrax. And then the 4th is injectional anthrax. It's still not super common, but it's becoming more recognized, and I thought it was worth mentioning. So what happened in these attacks and what went wrong? Well, I want to first be upfront and say the US wasn't behind. They'd actually started looking at bioterrorism in the years heading up to these attacks. So in 1997, they defined BSATs, which are biologically select agents or toxins, and they started regulating them. 2 years later, in 1999, they established the Laboratory Response Network, or the LRN, which had the goal of identifying bioterrorism agents quickly. And then in that same year, they created the Strategic National Stockpile, or the SNS, and that was stocked with essential supplies in the event of an emergency. One thing to note on the SNS is that it was primarily thought of in terms of smallpox, and even then it wasn't stockpiled enough to actually address an entire outbreak had that occurred with smallpox. So when we're talking about the issues, the first and perhaps the most important one was communication, and this is something that we've talked about in class. But communication between the levels themselves went fairly smoothly, so local with local. The issue became when local tried to work with state or state with federal. These did not work as smoothly, and there was a lot of issue over who was making the decisions. And a lot of that was because previous relationships were not being maintained or they hadn't been formed in the first place. So you had people who really hadn't met, didn't know each other, didn't know each other's styles, trying to work through it at the same time as this crisis. And then the other issue is that they really hadn't taken into account the fact that they have to be working with law enforcement and emergency response, things that don't normally fit into this triad, which I'll go over in a minute. The second piece on communication was the method of communication. It really was a patchwork of how people were talking to each other. Some were using phone, some were using email. It was kind of a hodgepodge, and there were events of people just completely being out of the loop because their communication was cut off. And then this triad, I think, is important because it shows the relationship between public health and healthcare. And a really good example of how this broke down is what you see in the third part, which was an example of when physicians were getting individuals coming into hospitals. And physicians, they didn't know what they were looking for in terms of the anthrax exposures. And they were under the assumption that public health individuals were just going to come in, they're given one or two sentences about here's what you need to look for. Public health officials were under the assumption that physicians already knew this. So you have all these people coming in with chills and fever and cough, flu-like symptoms, and they're not really getting full information on either side to clear that communication channel. So that was a very big issue. The second issue, like I mentioned previously, this was immediately following 9/11. So you can imagine the public is already half scared to death. They've gone through an extremely traumatic event as a country, and they're trying to just get back to some form of normal. Then having a bioterrorism event, which I think even the word has the ability to cause a lot of fear in people, certainly was not helping. The other thing is that because this attack used the mail system, it brought a lot more people in because everybody has access to the mail system. Everybody uses it. And so a lot of people were worried that they were going to be affected in ways that other attacks might not have. So for this reason, there were a lot of white powders that people were panicking and thinking that they'd been exposed to anthrax when it wasn't anthrax. On tone, again, a big issue was the media. The media was really lacking a single, clear, informative voice on what was going on, who was doing it, who was in trouble, who was being exposed. And the tone was very unsure, and that did not reassure the public at all. The third issue was preparation, primarily on the local and state levels. They did have plans and they did have exercises, but they hadn't adequately tested them completely. So you could test this half and this half, but you didn't put the two of them together. A big part of this was that they had backup plans for people to help them, such as partners, but they didn't solidify those relationships. It was more of a sure, and then it never got solidified. And the other issue was they were trying to create plans, but they hadn't considered that you were working across jurisdictions and between public and private entities. The exercises didn't really accurately model those. The fourth issue was capacity. So the LRN really had trouble handling the flux of samples that needed to be taken care of. Like I said, the LRN had only been established 2 years previously. And at the end of this, there ended up having been 350,000 samples and specimens tested. So that is a large amount for this resource that had really just started. And as a result of that, the anthrax didn't get identified for almost a month, which really was not great for the narrative in the public and in the media. And then finally is funding. I think this is an issue that we still have today. There was funding, but it was not regular and it was not sustainable. So you could have a federal grant, but it wasn't being maintained and maybe that money stopped coming through. and you have issues purchasing lab equipment or funding exercises, really just anything with that money. So for my recommendations on what happened, of course, primarily we need clear communication, and that's between levels in addition to amongst the levels. And a big part of that is establishing relationships, knowing each other's style and what you're going to be doing, and maintaining those so you don't run into these issues once the crisis has already started. We want regular media statements, and the important thing is we want valuable information going out. We don't want to be blundering. If we don't know, say that and say it confidently, and just say we're working on it, and to not just cause more panic among the public. The third is just practice. I mean, these exercises, I think we all know that they work, they help, these plans are beneficial, but you have to know what's going to happen and work through those roadblocks. The fourth piece was to increase the LRN capacity. That's both in the number of facilities and in their location around the country, and being able to process those samples quicker and get a result back. And then the fifth is, of course, funding, which I think we all need, and a lot of public health agencies have this issue today, and to just make sure that it's stable and it's regular and dependable so they can run these programs. And then this was a piece I just wanted to mention on policy. The 2001 attacks really started a new phase of public health with the entwining of disasters. So this was a quote I thought was really good. It says, this was the first time that public health entered the sphere of emergency response, and really showed them connecting and how interdependent they were on a crisis such as this. So something that came out of that was the BioWatch program. It's put on by the US Department of Homeland Security. It was inspired by these 2001 attacks. And it's basically a surveillance system taking air samples to make sure that if there are any bioterrorism agents out there, that they get registered and acknowledged as quickly as possible. So here are my references, and let me know if you have any questions.